Ahoy hoy, I'm Planarwalk, and before we get into it, I just want to say ahoy hoy to Ken Wheeler, because it is actually possible that he might be watching this video. Now some people might say, what makes you think that he would watch any of your videos? You're getting way too ahead of yourself. However, one of his videos that he released sounded awfully like it was responding to criticisms that AB Science and myself had made about Counterspace.
By the word counterspace, which is kind of a ridiculous word. I mean, say counterspace, I think we're like talking about the counterspace in your kitchen where you chop your vegetables up on. A lot of people actually attack me using the word counterspace.
So yeah, that does sound like stuff that AB Science and myself has said in the past. Now seeing as I think that there's a good possibility that Ken Wheeler is watching this video, I do want to offer a bit of a challenge to Ken Wheeler, and that is, let's have a debate, or even just a discussion. Do I think Ken Wheeler will accept? Well, seeing as he most likely has me blocked, I don't think that he will, but the offer is out there. But anyway, let's get into the video.
Counterspace. Something to be true, it has to be logical and wise, and certainly so mirrored in every way in nature.
Oh, we're getting word salad right from the get-go, I see. Now, when it comes to what is true, that's actually a rather messy subject. However, there are some lines of philosophy that can help us simplify it. Because, as it would turn out, trying to figure out what is actually true is rather difficult. So the main way that people work out what is actually true these days is we have an idea, we make sure that it can make predictions, we make sure that there is evidence to back it up, and we make sure that the evidence that we use to back it up and the predictions that it makes can be replicated. Oh, and another thing is that it needs to be falsifiable as well, because if it's not falsifiable, then we cannot tell whether it is true or false at all. And I have loosely described the basics of the scientific method there, because the scientific method is pretty much about trying to figure out what is true.
Us crazy human critters, of course, have all sorts of words, and words are just concepts. Words are not things themselves. People get hung up on words, and people will, of course, debate words endlessly, but...
Now, I actually agree with what Ken Wheeler said here, because there's so many times when you get people that think that a word can only be used a specific way. I have heard so many times a flat earther say something along the lines of, water seeks its level, level means flat, therefore the earth is flat. One of the issues there is that they're trying to make a statement about the shape of the earth based on the definition of a word that they have, which is not how anything works. Now that being said, when we're talking about science, it is important to have very specific definitions so that people can understand what it is you're trying to say. It is also important that those definitions actually mean something coherent, because otherwise it's a useless definition.
Talk about counterspace, and I have to admit, counterspace is kind of a ridiculous word. There are a few people that have used counterspace. We could say zero-point energy, we could say the ether, we could say a sink, we could say the plane of inertia. We could talk about the null point, the intersecting modality, and substrate, the foundation under all phenomena.
So here is my criticism of what Ken Wheeler has said there, and that is that definition of counterspace would be so vague and descriptive of so many different things that it becomes useless. If you are trying to say the ether, just say the ether. It's not that hard. And if you're trying to say that it binds concepts like the ether and null point energy all together, then just say that it binds those concepts together rather than defining it as those concepts. Every time I hear Ken Wheeler or a Ken Wheeler fan define counterspace, I seem to get a different idea of what counterspace is each time. Sometimes it sounds like an alternate dimension, sometimes it sounds like the lowest possible energy state of a system, and sometimes it sounds like portals that spew out energy. Now, I feel like someone could bring up something like dark matter or dark energy to say, ha, look, those things are very loosely defined in science, and therefore it's okay to have very loose definitions. And for dark matter and dark energy, yeah, those are loosely defined. They're basically defined as stuff that we don't know. But that is kind of the point, because scientists know it's there, They just don't know what it is, and that's the goal, to try and figure out what it is so that they can define it well. He also said that some people call Counterspace a sink. Now, Ken, I don't know if you've ever been in a kitchen, but usually a sink takes away from the total amount of counter space that you have. I've never seen people try to cut up meat, for example, in a sink. I've seen them try to cut it up on Counterspace, but never a sink.
But what about Counterspace? What are we referring to in Counterspace? We have to understand, of course, what space is and what are we meaning by the word Counterspace, which is kind of a ridiculous word. I mean, say Counterspace, I think we're like talking about the counterspace in your kitchen where you chop your vegetables up on. But I mean, it doesn't make any difference if we say ether, say pure potential, the plane of inertia, or a sink.
If those all mean the same thing, why not just use one and stick to it?
A black hole, for example, is nothing other than a super dielectric sink. Human beings are fundamentally confused about a black hole because we actually have no analogy here on Earth by which to compare it to.
You know, not everything needs an analogy to make sense. It just helps some people understand it better if it does have an analogy. And besides, there are things that can be analogous to a black hole. A drain, for example, is rather analogous because as you get closer to the drain, it becomes harder and harder to escape, to the point where there's no way that you're escaping from that drain. That is, of course, assuming that the drain has enough force to suck you in.
It's not a hole. Call a black hole a hole, and it's not actually black.
So I'm trying to work out what he means by it's not black, because you can't really see a black hole by virtue of no light being able to escape from it. So it's pretty much black. Now, you could try and make the argument that because of gravitational lensing, it's the color of the light that it lenses, but that's not really the color of the black hole itself, is it?
And black holes are actually emitting, as is evidenced by countless telescopes and countless images, whether you agree with it or not, emitting out trillions and trillions of tons of the most fundamental particle, of which all atoms are the basic building block thereof, emitting out hydrogen. You can look up galactic jets.
So when it comes to galactic jets, we actually don't quite know what they're made of. We think that they're made of electrons, positrons, and or protons. And in case anyone was wondering, they come from matter that the black hole accelerates, rather than from the black hole itself.
And of course, fundamental matter, i.e. hydrogen, is nothing other than super high energy light, and that was recently proven. That was a prediction I made years ago. I've always spent years trying to reconcile light and matter.
So to me, it sounds like Ken Wheeler is misunderstanding something pretty badly, because I'm pretty sure that to generate matter from light, you have to collide the light, which is different from high energy light. And also, that collision does not produce hydrogen. It produces an electron and positron pair. And a positron is not the same thing as a proton. And this is part of a process, and I'm not making it up, called the Breit-Wheeler process. I am not joking about that. And it's nothing to do with Ken Wheeler, by the way. It's a person called John Wheeler who described this.
I'd like to actually get on to explaining counterspace in as simple a terms as possible.
Oh, please do, because I bet that will help a lot of people.
Once again, black hole is nothing other than a dielectric sink. It's where actual dielectricity overthrown magnetism's ability to keep anything in the visible universe. When I actually talked about the Earth, if we were able to reduce every atom to its nucleus only, then the Earth would be something smaller than the size of a marble. People need to fundamentally realize that magnetism is that which gives mass and magnitude to everything in the universe.
I like how the first thing that he says when explaining counterspace is that we've got to accept his premises. Despite the fact that magnetism is a force and mass is a property of an object.
When we actually have a mass that's so large and it becomes a point source object, essentially a super gigantic magnet out in space, it vanishes from the visible universe. This video is not about black holes, but I want to make that simple analogy that things only have mass and magnitude due to magnetism only, and the three-dimensional force vector of magnetism is the torus.
Does Ken Wheeler realize that a vector is not a shape like a torus? I get the feeling that he means the word field, but doesn't want to say field because he doesn't like that word. so instead uses the word vector incorrectly.
I could actually draw on this if I had a Sharpie marker. Not that I really want to draw on this apple because I'll eat it later. I could actually take a knife here and actually could draw a three-dimensional S-curve right into the center of the apple and come out here and come out inverse here. So we actually have this three-dimensional force vector that is magnetism, the loss of energy or inertia of counterspace of the dielectric.
I have no idea how those statements are supposed to relate to one another at all. All I know is that he wants to eat the apple, and good for you because an apple a day keeps the doctor away.
What do we mean by counterspace? Rather a nonsense term. We're talking about the plane of inertia, or the point where all potential exists. The loss of that energy or potential is the only thing human beings rationalize as existing. We reify space as something that exists and it doesn't exist. Space is the after effect of a divergent magnetic field. It is literally the inverse or negative image of pure potential.
It really sounds like what he's trying to do there is complicate space in order to make counterspace a thing. The way that I would describe space would probably be something along the lines of the setting in which everything exists. Wonder what Google says. Google says the dimensions of height, depth, and width within which all things exist and move, which is pretty much what I said.
What is the opposite of pure potency? It would be pure impotency.
Ken, you might want to choose your words a little bit more wisely because I have the maturity of a 5-year-old. Most people have the maturity of a 5-year-old, whether they'll admit it or not, and are probably typing up in my comment section funny jokes about your impotency. Now, I know the word can mean other things aside from erectile dysfunction, but it's hard not to think about that when that is what I'm currently experiencing from sitting through your video.
The greatest masters throughout all of history have said that space is impotency.
That statement by itself really means nothing unless you're talking about God maybe needing a bit more Viagra.
And it's so great because our entire lives we've listened to science fiction. Space is infinite. It goes on and on forever. But it's nothing. It has no properties. It's the super gigantic toothless dragon that is forever sleeping. It is nothing itself.
Now that is fair. However, I don't think that implies the existence of counterspace. But we're going to keep that in mind because it's probably the most important thing that Ken Wheeler has said throughout this video.
A lot of people actually attack me using the word counterspace, and I'm not the first one to actually use the word counterspace, but who cares what term we assign it? We want to call it the ether, 0-point energy, the plane of inertia. It doesn't, my God, this smells really good. It doesn't matter what we call it.
That is true, but I'm still going to poke fun at the term counterspace because just imagining it as the space on top of a counter is rather funny.
We're talking about the inverse of space. Pure, unmanifest, non-Cartesian, anti-Cartesian potential. Yeah?
The problem with counterspace, though, is that if it's the opposite of space, then it shouldn't really exist within space, should it?
Here's the fact. Like on the power lines that actually go out in front or back of your house, if you actually increase the voltage, because this is a fact, by the way, the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. In the case of human comprehension, something that's larger can hold more stuff, like a larger box can hold more stuff. But in terms of energy, the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance.
I'm going to need a citation for that because everything that I know about energy would say that if you want to transport more energy, you need either bigger or more lines. This is absolutely the case when it comes to audio. If you want louder sound, you're going to need more energy. And to get more energy, you're going to need bigger cables. This is something that I know as I have had to help wire up stages. It has been a few years now, but I still remember it. Now there is a time when smaller space means kind of higher capacity, but that's not in the context of energy. That's in the context of clock speed on a CPU. And that's just simply because the smaller the CPU, the less distance things have to travel.
This little thing that, you know, a dumb monkey, for example, would say looks like a piece of poo from a rat, is the pure potential for the tree.
Now technically, yes, but you also need nutrients and atmosphere and all that kind of stuff, but maybe I'm nitpicking your analogy a little bit too much.
Analogously, and counterspace has to be mirrored in everything in nature, and it is. This is pure potential the seed, within which, of course, is potential for another tree and countless thousands of apples in perpetuity.
My question would be, why does everything in nature have to be mirrored? Sure, there are quite a few things that are mirrored, but not everything has to be mirrored. I mean, what is the opposite of time? Is it counter time? I shouldn't give him ideas.
This, of course, this actually has volume, so we can't take that analogy too far, but everything that we actually experience in life is experienced through orifices and holes.
Do you want to know what's not experienced through holes and orifices? Impotency. There's a reason for that. I am sorry, but this video just gives so many opportunities for these jokes, and I do have the maturity of a 5-year-old, so I am going to take it, you know.
We actually give birth through orifices. We experience everything in our life through orifices of our ears and our eyes and our nose and our mouth. And all of this is mirrored in nature.
I am confused about how all your holes are mirrored. There is possibly a mirror in front of you, but please do not give a demonstration with your holes being mirrored.
And yet, that people would mock this term counterspace, and it is kind of a ludicrous term, but that's only if you get wrapped up in words. If you're so superficial that you get wrapped up in words, then of course you're never going to understand anything.
I mean, I've moved on to mocking the term impotency, because that's far funnier, although I'll still make jokes about counterspace. But the whole thing about getting wrapped up in words are what we use to communicate. So it's good to have well-defined words, especially when we're talking about scientific concepts.
Anyway, getting back to the power lines. In the case of a power anomaly on the power lines, if the voltage spikes, the power lines, which dangle kind of loosely between the power poles, if the voltage spikes, which is the dielectric, yeah? If the voltage spikes, the power lines, as they're drooping there between the poles, will actually come together. The actual toroid itself will shrink, yeah? Because the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance.
So I asked a scientist about this, and Ken Wheeler kind of has things right, but for the wrong reasons. So the things that matter here is the current, which determines the strength of the magnetic field, and the direction of the current, which determines whether the power lines are pulled together or pushed apart. Now, the only time in which voltage would matter is if you've got a constant amount of power, because power equals voltage times current. So an increase in voltage would mean a decrease in current, and vice versa.
Higher voltage makes those power lines actually sway towards one another, towards counterspace.
So counterspace is the ether, but it's also a point between the power lines. Even though the ether is supposed to be everywhere, you can understand why people would be getting confused at this, right?
If, however, the amperage increase, the actual power lines will actually push themselves apart. If the magnetism, along the power lines increases, they'll actually push themselves apart because the actual toroidal geometry of the magnetic field has been increased along the power lines. So if the voltage spikes, they'll actually swing towards one another. If the magnetism spikes along the power lines, they'll actually be pushed apart.
So this is just wrong, because as I described earlier, it's more about the direction of the current as to whether they're pushed apart or pulled together. Also, I'm not sure if he meant amperes or not, but if he did mean amperes, amperes means current. And more current means that there is more electricity flowing through the wires. So if Ken Wheeler was 100% right about the reasons for wires being pushed apart and pulled together, then he would be contradicting himself. Because earlier he claimed the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. But newsflash, more current means more stuff is going through those wires.
This is a fact, by the way. You could look this up. Don't take my word for it, but...
That's actually a good piece of advice from Ken. Don't take his word for things that he says.
People always have energy backwards. People think of energy as like a nuclear blast, for example. It's a gigantic mushroom cloud. By the way, a mushroom cloud, as it rises, the only reason it rises is due to heat. That mushroom cloud is what shape? Mushroom cloud is toroidal shape. People consider that to be energy. That's the impotency of energy.
So I have no idea what the shape of a nuclear blast has to do with anything, but Ken, it is energy. There is thermal energy there, a lot of thermal energy.
You think about it, and I'm just using this analogously in the case of a nuclear explosion, the actual increasing mushroom cloud where space and volume and all sorts of horrible things are generated, including a gigantic toroidal mushroom cloud is generated, which rises due to heat. It is not energy, it's the impotency of energy. True energy would be that softball-sized lump of plutonium, fissionable plutonium, or fissionable uranium. The seed, if you will.
Can somebody please get this man a science book? I don't care if you have to airdrop a whole lot of science textbooks over his house, because he has a lot of learning to do. Specifically about different types of energy, because you've got kinetic energy, thermal energy, nuclear energy, chemical energy, gravitational energy. There are a lot of different types of energy. Now, when energy is stored in something and not being used, that is what is called potential energy. Now, when a nuclear explosion happens, the energy that's contained within the uranium or whatever is causing that explosion, that energy is just transformed from one type of energy to another type of energy, because energy cannot be created or destroyed. So I get what Ken is trying to say. However, please use the correct terminology if you want to have a serious discussion about these things. Because otherwise it sounds like you don't really know what you're talking about and just making up definitions for words in order to try and sound smart.
Anyway, this is the conjugate geometry of the universe. The negative image of a hyperboloid, or the hourglass shape, is the torus. The negative image of the torus is the hyperboloid. The superposition of both is, of course, a sphere.
I really don't see how the geometry of these things has to do with anything that Ken Wheeler is talking about, but hey, maybe I'm just not big-brained enough to get it.
This is the conjugate geometry that actually explains everything in the universe. Everything is either force and motion, inertia, and acceleration.
Yeah, I really don't see how any of this explains anything. Like, if someone just says toroids explain things, that doesn't explain anything, really.
The loss of that energy or inertia from counterspace. Yes, and why is there anything at all? And then, of course, we have to get into explaining the extrinsic attribute of the absolute of the agathon, which is phi to the power of -3, as against that plane of inertia or counterspace, i.e. the ether itself. Well, we use the word counterspace. You would say sink. The sink of counterspace, the plane of inertia, the nexus point from which everything is manifest.
So, people will often criticize me for saying that Ken Wheeler uses a lot of word salad. Now, what word salad is when you use a lot of words that don't really add anything to what you're talking about. Now, the way in which Ken Wheeler uses word salad is he uses a lot of somewhat big words, all in ways that don't really make sense, which make it very, very difficult to pass any kind of meaning out of what he's saying. Now, that does lead people to saying things like, well, if you don't understand what I have to say, that's not word salad. That's just not understanding what Kermit Peterson has to say. However, if I have to take a sentence, try and deconstruct it and go, okay, so this part means this, and this part means this, and work out how this part relates to this part, and okay, how do these two parts work together to try and create some kind of meaning, which I have to do for a lot of Ken Wheeler's things, that is word salad. But hey, let me try and show you what I mean here.
Of course, we have to get into explaining the extrinsic attribute of the absolute of the agathon.
So here we've got the intrinsic attribute of the absolute or the agathon. I could not find what the agathon is, so we're just going to focus on the absolute instead. So the absolute could be defined as the supreme being or the sum of all being. So in a way, it's kind of like everything, I guess.
Which is phi to the power of -3.
So that intrinsic attribute is phi to the -3, which is 0.236.
As against that plane of inertia or counterspace, i.e. the ether itself.
So here we've got 0.236, which is the intrinsic attribute of basically everything, against the plane of inertia. You see how I'm having trouble trying to connect these things together, right? But it gets even better, because we could have 0.236 against the plane of inertia is the intrinsic attribute of basically everything. And now I'm left with the task of trying to figure out, okay, which thing here is he actually meaning? And also, when it comes to the absolute, that has multiple possible meanings as well, so which absolute is he talking about? So we're at the point where the meaning of that sentence is completely up to interpretation. If a meaning of a sentence is up to interpretation, I'm sorry, but that is word salad.
You say, well, a magnet has a north pole and a south pole. It actually doesn't. It has the inverse of counterspace. The inverse of counterspace is the three-dimensional force vector of magnetism itself, which creates space.
So it sounds like what he's saying is because magnetism creates space, according to him, therefore magnets don't have a north pole and south pole. How do those things follow from each other? To me, it sounds like a non sequitur fallacy. I wonder how many fallacies Ken Wheeler has used that I've missed because I usually don't pay attention to whether people are using fallacies or not.
What is counterspace? I mean, aren't we supposed to be answering a question in our minds such that we have a more clear and precise understanding?
Yes, and I still haven't figured out what counterspace is or why we need separate terms to explain it when apparently it just means the ether.
What is counterspace? Pure potential, the plane of inertia, the non-Cartesian or anti-Cartesian nexus from which all things spring.
So in other words, we could describe it as some kind of alternate dimension where energy comes from, which is how I've described it previously.
Counterspace, or the ether, or subspace, zero-point energy, who cares what people call it? It doesn't make any difference. These are merely conceptual words in English language only to refer to something that people don't have any concept thereof.
Well, it doesn't matter what you call it, because if you're using two different words to describe the exact same thing, why not just use one word consistently to describe that thing, and preferably the word that people are more familiar with? When you introduce words that people aren't familiar with, people have to learn what that word means and work out, okay, why are you using that word instead of the other word that means the exact same thing?
People talk endlessly about space as if it is something that does things and acts upon other things. I mean, that's the fundamental fallacy of relativity, and of quantum it's reified this concept that has no properties, that does not act upon other things. Yeah. Two masses in space, they're not bending space and time. They actually have a dielectric torsion. They're actually accelerating not towards one another, but towards a null point in counterspace.
I mean, general relativity does use space-time to predict things like time dilation. Can you explain that with just magnetism?
I fundamentally agree that counterspace is a crazy word. But you fundamentally, if you have a brain at all, have to understand that there is no apple without the seed of counterspace.
Wait, so counterspace creates apples now? I was beginning to wonder how all those apples were ending up on the counterspace.
For anybody to deny or scoff at counterspace is to ludicrously say that you have apples or apple trees without this. Pure, unmanifest potential, because the seed is not sprouted. Let's not take the analogy too far. I mean, how stupid would someone be to scoff at counterspace? Might as well scoff at apples and apple trees without the seeds of pure potential, within which all potential exists.
Except with the seed, we know how that creates a tree which creates an apple. We know that it uses nutrients from the ground, so it's not just the seed, it's obviously nutrients as well, and carbon dioxide to create a tree and create apples. Now when it comes to potential energy, we know the mechanisms for potential energy, how it's stored in different things, and we don't need counterspace to explain it. It'd be like saying that you can't explain a horse without a unicorn. Horses exist independently of unicorns unless you are H. Bomber Guy. Introducing unicorns to try and explain horses is introducing something that's really just completely unnecessary and probably doesn't even exist.
Of course, what is potential is not actual.
Well, no, you're just wrong, because if you have the potential for something, then all the things to create that thing are there, existing within reality, even potential energy. If you want to build a house, all the things to build that house exist within reality. They just don't exist in the form of a house yet. However, they do have the potential to become a house. That potential just may not be realized yet.
But it is impossible for anybody to deny counterspace, regardless of what term they wish to assign to it. It's completely impossible, it's illogical, absurd, and laughable. You cannot have volume without that which makes volume possible.
Well, I deny counterspace, so it is possible to deny counterspace. As for what makes volume possible, that's space that makes volume possible, not counterspace.
Because space is not a thing at all. Space has no properties. That's a direct quote from Nikola Tesla, by the way.
Well, even if space has no properties, space still exists because we need the dimensions of height, width, and depth to, exist. But anyway, that was Ken Wheeler trying to explain counterspace. I haven't really learnt anything from this video except that Ken Wheeler needs some science books delivered to his house urgently. Now, one thing that I'd like to get delivered to my place, because it sounds very fun, is a Ken Wheeler bobblehead. However, to do that, I need money, which brings me to Patreon. If I can get up to about $600 on Patreon, that should give me enough to get a custom-made Ken Wheeler bobblehead. So that is the goal. But I do need to give a big thank you to my current $20 or more patrons. So a big thank you to Hugh Jars, MC Nutkin, Jane Spade, Shaki, Wolfie, Maury, Greymore Ghost, Kid Vicious, and Sacha Campbell. If you want to support me on Patreon, there will be a link appearing somewhere around there. But anyway, I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.
Well, the photon idea is an abstraction from misunderstanding the coaxial nature of light, which is a refraction of compression along the dielectric. Yes, and that of course is just a compound ether perturbation modality, because that's all a field is, and I define that in my definition. Counterspace. Counterspace. Rate of induction. Counterspace. 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 Well, it's the ether. Counterspace. Counterspace. Harmonic incommensurability.
Harmonic what?
Incommensurability. Not even a single scientist on this earth has ever said, quantoid disk model of projective geometry. Not even a single scientist on this earth has ever said, harmonic incommensurability. Not even a single scientist on this earth has ever said, counterspace. Many people believe me, then they would of course be crazy. Of course be crazy. Many people believe me, then they would of course be crazy. Of course be crazy. Many people believe me, then they would of course be crazy. Of course be counterspace.
What?
Counterspace. Rate of induction. Counterspace. 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 Well, it's the ether. Counterspace. Counterspace. Well, the photon idea is an abstraction from misunderstanding the coaxial nature of light, which is a refraction of compression along the dielectric. Yes, and that of course is just a compound ether perturbation modality, because that's all a field is, and I define that in my definition. Counterspace. Rate of induction. Counterspace. 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 Well, it's the ether. Counterspace. Counterspace. Counterspace.